So if you're watching my previous video, we should be at a situation now where we've got this employee list report on the screen. There's several things I'm not happy about it, but I'm not going to play with this one because it's a wizard. I'm going to show you on another video shortly how you would actually create it manually and get a better result. However, the purpose of this video is to talk about how do we actually deploy this report so people can actually see it now. Well, we've got our employee list report. We've told it to go to a shared data source. So two things have got to happen. The data source needs to be deployed to the server, as so does the report, because there's no point in having the report without the data source and vice versa. So how do we deploy them? Well, we can right click and you'll see deploy is on there, but at the moment it won't work. The reason being is we need to set up this project which we're in, this HR reports project, to actually point to the server in question. Because remember, you could have multiple servers that you could be deploying reports to. One server could be in HR reports, the other one could be finance, the other one could be sales, etc, etc. So what we need to do is we need to define the server that we're deploying these reports to. So with HR reports highlighted at the top, it's very important we highlight here, we right click and choose properties. Now this brings up the connection properties screen. And really all we need to do is focus on this section here, which is telling us where we're going to deploy things. So first of all, it says overwrite data source is set to false. Absolutely. You could have 50 reports all using the same data source. So if you accidentally change one of your data sources, last thing you want to do is affect all reports on your server. So by default it's on false, but you can obviously change it to true, which basically overwrites the whole thing. So what have we got underneath it? Well, we've got the data sources target folder, which is called data sources. Fine, that's great. So all data sources will be stored in a folder on the report server called data sources. Let's just jump onto it over here. So at the moment there's nothing on our report server. So I got there by going to localhost. Depending on your configuration, you may have to put a port number in. I had to, and then it's /reports, and then you will get this page up. If you haven't got this, you may want to have a look at my configuration video to understand how you would set it up for first time use. So back in here, what I need to do is leave it on data sources there. What's the target report folder? HR reports. Sounds good to me. And really the target server. So at the bottom it actually tells you what you really need to type in here. For example, http://server name /report server. So what that's telling me then is I need to put it to this particular location, but obviously replace server name to whatever it is. So I'm going to put in http://. I'm going to put in localhost because I'm on my local machine. However, you may need to put in a server name. I'm going to then do colon. The reason I've got to do colon is because I've got it on a different port number. Remember, if I just bring back the report, the web browser, I've got it here on 8081. So in here on my bid section, I also need to tell it to be 8081. If you're just going to localhost, don't worry about ports whatsoever. The reason you've got to have ports, as discussed in the configuration video, is purely because you could have multiple servers running on the one box, and generally 80, which is where it would default go to, would be exclusively for web services. Now, because this isn't technically web services anymore, because it's 2008, I've had to shunt it onto a different port number. So after the / here, I'll just put in report server. And all being well, I'll just click on apply and OK. Liked all of that. So let's just try it. Now you could deploy individually, or you could just right click at the top here and choose deploy. So I'm going to just do that. Deploy. Now what deploy does is it also builds the project. Notice now in my output window I have a series of commands coming up where it's saying it's deploying and building. What's important about building? It error checks. It checks your syntax. It makes sure that as far as it can tell it's fine. Doesn't necessarily mean your report's right, but it has passed the test. So what has happened here is I've build complete with 0 errors. It then starts the deploy process. It says I'm going to deploy to this location. I'm going to deploy the AdventureWorks to the data sources folder that we agreed upon, and it's going to deploy the employee list report to the HR report section. So at the end of that it said it succeeded, 0 failed and 0 was skipped. Great, let's have a look then. So let's just jump back into our web browser, so localhost /reports, and I'm just going to click on refresh now, and all being well I should have now at least 2 new folders. And there we are. Notice they say new, and I have data sources and I have HR reports. So let's just have a look at data sources. And there's my DSET Adventure Works, and if I just click on it, it will then go into the properties of it. So here's where it gets interesting, because you can now go via the report manager, go in and change things. For example, the location of the server. So you may be using a test server to start with, so the data source is on my media server, but I may have a live server later on, so I can, if I wanted to, change it to a different data source, and also the initial catalog being the database that it connects to. I'm just going to click away not to do those changes and go back in. And what have we got further down? Well, notice it's saying Windows Integrated Security. So what that means is, if I run that report now, it will use my Windows account to use the data source connection. Now this is very important if you're working in a network. For example, I'm the administrator, I can deploy reports to the server. I can now run those reports. However, Fred Bloggs, who has only user access, may not be able to run the report because you're using Windows Integrated. So what would happen is he would start up that employee list report, but then not be able to connect to the data source because Fred Bloggs' account does not have access to this location. So quite often in reporting services, you don't leave it on that. You actually either choose a credential supplied by the user running the report and then set up a username and password, so they have to type in a username and password of your choice, or alternatively use credentials. So quite often what I would do is I would actually put in a domain, and you wouldn't use administrator for those of you which are really tech savvy, but for this purpose I would say put in the administrator in the domain and the password that it's using, and then I would actually say use as Windows credentials when going to the data source. That way then anybody that runs the reports would go via this account to the database. Well, because I'm on the actual server myself and it's just for training purposes, I'm going to leave it on Windows Integrated. You could put it on credentials not required, but I have had no reason to use that. That is one of the most unsecure options on the planet. So let's just leave it on Windows Integrated. Now you can apply, you can move it, you can generate model. Model will be discussed in a much later video, and you can delete. Well, I don't want to do any of those things because I've not changed anything. So I'll just click back onto Home at the top here, which will take me back to the main screen. So let's go to HR Reports, and there's my employee list. So let's click on it, and all being well, it should now, using my account credentials, go to the data source, then from the data source to the database. And all being well, there's my employee list on the screen. So what we've talked about on this video is just simply how to deploy a report, and that, just to summarize, is back in bids. You would right click on the project, nowhere else but the project, choose properties, and then in this particular area of the dialog box you would specify the name of where the data source is going to be kept as regards the folder, ditto for the report, i.e. the report folder we want to go to, and then finally the target URL, the location of where the reports are going. Now just one brief thing to finish on is you'll notice that I'm saying report server, whereas in our web browser we're going to the report manager, which is just called reports. Well, hey, let's just change the URL at the top and just choose report server. What you get is exactly the same structure, but it's not nice. It's in a horrible, horrible format. It's just a standard file list. So I can go into data sources, but at which point I can't really do much with it. It just shows me how the actual RDL script, or in this case the XML script, is configured. So if I go back and back again, go to HR Reports, there's the employee list. That will run as a report, but what you'll see is I've lost all my toolbar options at the top. So report server is another way you can access information, and quite often gets used when you're dealing with SharePoint integration. So can you use it? Yes. For these videos at this early stage, we won't be touching report server again, but suffice to say, you deploy to one location, you can actually view them in there. So next video we'll move into creating the report from scratch, so I hope you stay tuned.